Damskat Nagakyo. My name is Angelina Weenie. Nagwachi Potsenia, Sweet Grass First Nation. Nagwaya, in all the things that we do, language comes first. And so one of the things that we try to incorporate language in all that we do. And I just want to explain that word, Nisquamagu. And if you go to powwows and you'll see that when they're singing, the women will go and stand behind and they'll sing. And we call that Nisquamagu. And so I want to actually begin with a song to honor these women who I'm sitting with, and Nisquamagu, and that's what I'm doing. I'm singing and accompanying them. We're singing and we're honoring and accompanying them. So that's what I want. And so one of the things about race, and then also tobacco. Tobacco offerings begin the process. When we engage in Indigenous research, there's a spiritual and cultural process that we follow. And tobacco begins the process, that offering, that prayer, that, what we do will not cross the bounds of what is proper and ethical. And Alma did mention that, Bastahuin. That is foremost in terms of Indigenous research, that we do not cross the bounds of what is proper and right. And so when she mentions those things that happened with her when she residential school, those were, crossing those boundaries that were in place. And so we always remember that when we engage in research. And so the circle is important when we talk about Indigenous research methodology. And so we have the 4 aspects. The first one is mental. Why do we want this knowledge? And how are we going to use it? I remember a story by Richard Wagamis when he went to an elder and asked him for his knowledge. The elder said, you go and prepare these tobacco ties, and when you're preparing them, you think about why you want this knowledge and how you're going to use it. So that's the first important thing about Indigenous research. Who is going to benefit? Why is this important to you? So this is the question that we ask ourselves when we engage in these ways. Intent and purpose pave the way for research. And so for myself, I'm not, I never did see myself as a researcher, but it was something I had to do. And so when I did my master's thesis, my topic was on resilience, because I thought it was time to present a different picture of Indigenous people. So often we're looked at as people in need of healing, and people forget the gifts that we've been given that ground us. And so I looked at resilience. And spiritual. And this I quote from Bell 2018, refers to the idea that research without a spiritual connection is a dead piece of work. We need to follow cultural and spiritual processes and protocols so that our work does not bring harm. And again, I refer to that idea of Bastahuin. It's on us if we do things wrong. may not affect us immediately, but it'll affect maybe our children, our grandchildren. This is our belief. That's why we follow those ways. Emotional refers to the notion that research without an emotional connection does not have heart. Always you're working from here when you engage in this type of research. Physical is physical engagement with the community. It requires some sacrifice. And so before I started on anything, I would always engage in ceremony, go to ceremony, because that's where I offer my cloth and my tobacco, so that I'll be guided in what I need to do. So that I'll finish what it is I've set out to do. And language and culture are important components of Indigenous research. And here I'm going to quote from Mary Sisakamu. She did a language project for us in 2008. And she said, language and culture are spiritual and are connected to the natural laws of Matsuin, life. Understandings that guide the spirit of the task. That is our understanding of Indigenous research methodology. And so, my first work was my thesis on resilience. And then I did a self-study because I find it hard to go and ask people for their knowledge. And so I focused on, the methodology was self-study. And here's part of what I wrote. In the final analysis, I stated that I am the examiner of my own process of being subjected to an educational system that does not reflect who I am and where I come from. I have chosen to represent myself. The process has been one of reconciling my place, finding voice, and becoming conscious of the various discourses I have to contend with, which have relegated Aboriginal knowledge to the margins. So Indigenous research is putting ourselves forward so that it is centering our stories and privileging our perspectives. That is what Indigenous research is. And so engaging in research of this nature means having a sense of humility and a spiritual sense of things in working with First Nations communities. Alma talked about how when she started, she said, I don't know anything. So we begin with that process of, being in a place where the elders will also say this. I don't know anything. I can only speak to my own experience and what I have experienced in life. That is our knowledge. So I share some of these ideas with you. So I'll stop.
Thank you, first of all, for honoring us in this manner, because it's so it's very important, because it's part of the women's strength in terms of providing that support and that courage, and to facilitate what we're doing tonight. And I feel very honored and humbled to be part of that process, but also part of this community. I want to do a couple of things tonight. First, to introduce myself, but also read you a story to provide kind of like a direction, I guess, in terms of allowing you some opportunity to, reflect on some of the pieces that I'm thinking about in terms of future research and, ask for your guidance as well. So I will begin. Askika nepo tiskun sigason ataka kopni soze. That is my Cree name. I'm called the woman of the earth. Mary Sasakamus is representative of my colonized name, European and Christian civilization. There's no pun intended, but it's a far cry of saying who I am as a Cree woman. I wrote my thesis, Mother as Teacher, a Cree First Nations mother teaching through story, to celebrate the importance of the mother line of teaching and to explore the narrative of a stream of consciousness that speaks to the growth within. Reading authors like Polkinghorne, not forgetting, other theorists in the Western world like Gadamer and others that speak, even Weenie, who I look toward in terms of providing some philosophical framework, in a sense that, we're looking at that space between, or the in-between space. And Dr. Weenie speaks of it as from the periphery, curriculum from the periphery. And so there is that space that we're exploring. And in a small way, we're doing that. And we're bringing enlightenment of sorts to practice, whether it be theory, teaching, learning, etc. And so my thesis work is directly working with my mother and the teachings that she shared. And I used Polkinghorne's narrative theoretical discourse to support that stream of consciousness thought. And that gave me some validity and reliability to story, but it also illuminated the importance of language, culture, and identity. So, in part, for me, going through the process of thesis writing and the academic, to satisfy the academic portions of thesis writing, the more important learning, I think more of significance to me, was the sitting down with an elder and learning firsthand knowledge of teachings from her upbringing, her experienced, her lived story, and bringing that to life. And in the sense, that was my way of serving life and living life through that thread, and using that pathway to explain the importance of language, culture, and identity. Because in the end, what it did was bring more self-growth and self-development within that circle. Because I was the center. I was the center, as the elder spoke about, in terms of the teachings that were shared by my mom. So I really am a blessed child, because I still have my mom. I gotta wake you up, it's matzo. So let me tell you a story. This is something that I'm starting, kind of reflecting, some reflective pieces in there. And I'm just sharing tonight. I'm just sharing, and if there's any questions, any kind of guidance that you as learners can provide to me, I'd really appreciate it as well, because we're all in this together. So my story goes, it rained last night. Leaning on the patio rail, feeling the moist embrace of the wood, drunk on the freshness of natural fulfillment, I wondered about how much our children have lost about understanding the life-giving forces such as water. I thought about the Cree teachings of the night sky A sort of mindfulness swept over me in the quiet of the night, almost too soft of a whisper, but lingering still was that voice of awe searching for an answer. Is there a discipline in the many disciplines that teach the Cree understanding of epistemological space that interprets the breadth and depth of underlying teachings held in the streams of consciousness of our mothers, of our culture bearers, and of our elders? A philosophical assumption for sure, based on my plume of knowledge pampered by a lifetime of mothers and grandmothers' pedagogical legacy. For me, the mother line would naturally be a place to begin my story, but a remembrance of my adopted brother, the late Walter Lightning's words echo. When I was involved in Elder Sunchild, who told me about my mind and the plume of the eagle, that I would get confused or I would later forget that valuable knowledge and it would not be useful or beneficial to me. I prayed that I would not forget this experience of the night sky, the enduring reflection of processes infused with Cree ways of Cree ways of knowing that enlightened potential pathways to significant learning. I thought about the high incidence of trauma in children and youth. What about youth at risk? Many youth have forgotten, or worse yet, have never been introduced to Indigenous pathways to support growth and positive self-development. Standing beside me, Nagawi, my mother, gently steps forward and says, which means it smells beautiful. Reflecting back on that night and the joy of sharing the thirst of life for life by a seemingly inconspicuous happening like the rainfall made me think of our education and the schooling of our children. Youth in many cases, and even adults. What about their education, their schooling? How is it that the socio-cultural dynamic of Indigenous society unraveled to the extent of identity and cultural confusion and loss? Is it that the essence of Cree being flipped was weakened by a future of uncertainty? I would argue that there remains a search for individuals seeking place, a recognition that calls for belonging echoing in the roots of stories, sung in songs, and practiced in ceremonies of an Indigenous place. The search for meaning and interpretation and growing knowledge from a Cree perspective can be intriguing and enlightening. Certainly, the rekindling of the ages could potentially spark a new way of looking at Cree identity, language, and culture to define Cree essence of being. Unremarkably, that night passed like any other, yet the tug to awaken my spirit yearned me to tell my story. There is a story to tell, but how do I frame a narrative that lays buried in the antiquity of generations? That's the beginning.
Like, is there more?
It's a lot of soul. It's a lot of spiritual discovery. And as Angie said, anytime we begin, in any of the research that I was involved in, whether it be the language one that was quoted, or any of the pieces that we work toward, whether it's just a project in a school or a writing, we always put our ceremony first. And we bring our bundles, we bring our flags, we bring our words to ask for guidance. And that's the circle that the elder's talking about. That's all within that circle of understanding. And it's so kind and genuine and sincere because you cannot lie. And I think that's where the truth lies in our voice, to be able to express our voice in such a way that is honorable. And that's why our research from Indigenous perspectives become even more critical in this day and age, given the context in which we live with all the social ills. Our children need us, and we have to continue working toward that. Whether that is positive role modeling, what we practice and teach in our classrooms, even more critical. So I think just that being said, you know, mother as teacher for me validated that assumption and path of learning, which is manyfold, by the way, and it's multiple layers bring meaning to self and becomes internalized actualization of core understandings of self. So I believe in those storied lives. I believe in lived experience because it allows us to see the many perspectives of any situation. And that's why I find Indigenous research of value. And I want to give praise to the elder as well, because she brought up many aspects which we can take and run with. Because, you know, given that what is truly indigenized curriculum is found in those who have echoed wisdom in the wind, in the fire, on the earth, and in the sky. And I write, how do we come to know about self and those ancestors whose trails blazed before or become interpreted from in various forms today? We've seen some examples, we heard some tonight. So I hunger for this search. Hence, when I talk about future research, that's where that place of hunger comes, that center, right? And so I want to explore that and see what intentions, if any, you know, provide us with some more insight into epistemology in terms of anything, ecology and ethos of a place, or, you know, its connection to life and growth, especially in our children, youth, those in trauma. So that's where I come from. That's who I am. And I'm always pleased to assist in any way that I can in growing and learning in Indigenous education. Thank you.
No, school. That's it. Thank you. My name is Ida Swan. I am in the research I'm doing. There are three people that where I'm from have different names. Some people call them woodland tree, some people call them wood tree, some people call them Asnewig. So that's what I'm going to call myself, Asnewig, rock woman. There you go, rock tree woman. But that's not, I don't really, I have, my name is Ida, but I was born at Marasti from Halleck Narrows. I was born at Upaugasik, which is on the map, you'll find Sandy Narrows. It's, you can only get there by boat or by snowmobile in the wintertime. So I went through the same process that my generation went through, I suppose. So I went through European schooling, for college schooling. We used to call it education, but it's just schooling, I guess. I went to school, and for the first 10 years, I don't think I said a word. I copied and I copied. I think I'm still copying. I haven't stopped copying people. But anyway, and I also went to residential school, but I didn't go to residential school until the latter part, I guess, like when I was a teenager. I didn't go when I wasn't as unlucky as Alma. And thank you for your prayer. I really appreciate that and your story. And but I did experience a residential school also. The thing about residential school is we didn't all go to a school nearby. They didn't decide, oh, Ida, you're only a few miles from there, that's where you're gonna go. No, they decided how far you're gonna go. I ended up in Gordon's Reserve. And I was happy at first. I went out there and I looked out, it's sort of foggy, and the next morning, and I thought there was a lake out there. And then, oh my God, the lake out there. It turned out to be a field, so. That was a lonely place, being down there. But I used that experience though in my teaching. I've been a teacher for a lot of years. More years than I can count. But right now I'm teaching the teacher education program. I'm one of the instructors there. And one of the things that I follow is I always tell the students, you have to remember residential schools. They took away the spirit of our children. They took everything away. They went home with nothing. They didn't feel, they could do anything. They couldn't do the work that their parents wanted them to do. They couldn't really do they couldn't go find a job because they didn't have the skills for that. So, and they lost their confidence. Their ego was smashed. So it says, now your job is to nurture, just like Alma has done all her life, is nurture those students. It's your job to bring up their ego, to make them feel good. That's what the teacher education program does. You're training students to be caring, to learn how to nurture. Because you want a good society, you want people out there to feel good with themselves and to help each other and to share, and not to, not to find themselves in a place where they end up taking their lives. And we see so much of that. So the students are still getting schooling. So we need to put something in the education system. It's a beginning, and that thing has only started in the last not even 10 years. You get a lot of indigenous values and practices into the school system, but at least it's there. It's starting now. I know in Prince Albert with the public schools, they teach TP teachings. So at least the kids know they work with respect, respecting elders and helping elders. So they're doing that, and I appreciate that. But when I was growing up in Sandy Narrows, we were in I guess nowadays you can call it isolated. I didn't really think of it as an isolation, it was my home, right? But we were out there in the middle of the lake, I guess, in a bush, and we didn't have anything, no books, no radio. The only thing we had were stories. My father told the stories. My mother went to residential school, but she never told stories. No, I never really asked why. You don't ask, why people don't share. You just accept it. It was, I guess it wasn't until much later I realized why she wouldn't want to share. She was in residential school for 8 years. And at the end though, I lost my mom last year. She was 90 years old. And in the end, she said it was hard on her. She was only 7 years old when she went in. And it was really difficult because her sister wasn't there, her brothers weren't there. It was a hard time for her, but she never really talked about it. But my dad never went to any school, except, he was brought up within a community of Pelican Narrows or Sandy Narrows, and so he learned his values and his practices through his grandfather who brought him up. And that's where my research is centered, around the family and storytelling. And it focuses on family, because families are very important, especially for Indigenous people. The neutral family is a lonely family. There's only mom and dad. And the family we learned about through our schooling was a lonely one. I always wonder, where's their auntie? Well, how come they don't have aunties? How come there's no cousins around? But we have the kinship system. So when I say family, with family stories, I'm talking about my dad, the stories that my dad shared with me, as he shared a lot of stories with us. But he was an avid storyteller. It didn't really matter where we were at, if something, maybe he sees a pumpkin and he starts to tell a story. There's little things that triggered his mind, and he would tell a story. It wasn't always like that though, because when I was about 6 years old, we had to move from Sandy Narrows to go to school in Pelican, and everybody moved. So we were all moved to Pelican. So there was about 9 families in Sandy Narrows. We were all moved to Pelican Narrows. So it became like a ghost town. The only time we went there was in the summertime, and it's still like that. Like I have a cabin out there, so we go out in the summertime, and I wish I could go there in winter like this. I don't. I can't survive by myself. Anyway, I didn't understand why we ought to move. At the end of the day, I guess it was, we had an Indian agent. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of Indian agents. An Indian agent was a man who was appointed by Indian Affairs, or nowadays you put in Indigenous Affairs. And they became sort of the demigod of the reserve. They controlled the whole reserve. They controlled where people went, or where the children went to school. And if the children didn't go to school, they made sure that something happened to those, like they get taken away or whatever. So and we had an Indian agent in Pelican Narrows until 1976. That's recent. That's very recent. Fortunately, my dad was a trucker, so he spent a lot of his time on truck lights. He really didn't have to pay attention to the Indian agent, but he did what he needed to do, except for schooling. In that case, he had to make sure we were all in school. Otherwise, we would be taken away to residential school. So there was a day school, and then there's a residential school. Eventually, some of us ended up at residential school. I'm not saying that nobody from Pelican Narrows went to residential school. See, it's a very complicated community. The northern communities are very complex, I guess. They're what we call, Rupert Ross calls them instant communities. But like Pelican Narrows, nobody really had a home in Pelican Narrows. We lived in Sandy Narrows. There were families in Birch Forest, there were Woody Narrows. There were 9 other communities where people lived, and then they all moved them to Pelican Narrows. So those families came together in Pelican Narrows because of school. And if you didn't, you had a choice. The family had a choice. You went to the day school, And if you didn't want your kids to go to the day school, then off they went to residential school. And in our case, we stayed with our family till I was about 15 years old, and I went to residential school to advance my education. I was in grade 8 then, so I had to go a bit more education. I guess that's what they said. That was an unusual thing at that time, I guess, to try to advance their education, because most of the time it was just to get the kids away from the families and make them take the Indian out of them. That's what the residential schools meant to do. In a lot of cases, they did, and they never succeeded, but they did rain havoc on all families, and that's the sad part. So with storytelling that I have, I'm concentrating on, most of it comes from the stories my father has told us, and he passed on several years ago. And when I was going to start the paper, I went and talked to an elder. We have an elder and that works with us in Palacaneros. Her name is Florence Allen, Elder Florence Allen. She comes down to First Nations University Regina campus frequently. And she has been very good to us at the Northern Campus. She advised me that when you're going to use the words of somebody who has passed on, you have to do ceremony. You have to give the gift of tobacco. You have to drop tobacco and ask for assistance before you can start. So I had to do that. So that's just the foundation of the meaningful use of tobacco that Angelina talked about. It breaks down borders, and then it also helps you get in touch with your ancestors. You can pass on their knowledge. Because what they have is so important to us, to me anyway, that I felt that was something I needed to get done. So at the end of the day, most of my work is around the oral tradition. I did that with my master's. Now I'm working on it for my PhD. The oral traditions based on the Cree language and storytelling. We will see.
Ani Shnabem Daphne. Ani Sheshbamatsian. Nishin. Ani Sheshbamatsian. Nishin. Wikram Kong Dunjaba. Nido Minising. Ishkot Day Indigo. Mina Anali Dishnakaz. Omina Wandamba. I asked, I greeted you and asked that we speak Ojibwe a little bit. And I asked you how you're doing on Yeshua and the Shin is good and fine. I come from Wapamakong, Manitoulin Island. It's a small island in the middle of Lake Huron in Georgian Bay in Ontario. It's the largest island surrounded by fresh water in the world, and it's Canada's best kept secret. The population triples in summer, and this is the place that my parents are from, and my great-grandparents, and my great-great-grandparents, and the Giteo before them. So we've been there for quite a few generations. Midominasing is a place that's part of the secret migration story, where the Anishinaabe journeyed in learning the prophecy of the coming of the white people. And in that journeying, there were several resting places, several places that were safe to stop. And they were islands in the Great Lakes, Michilimackinac, and Bawatang, and a few other places. So it's one of the resting places in the prophecy, and it's a strong medicine place, because there's a dreamer's rock on that island that maybe some people from the west may have visited. And that sacred stone is a place where people would go to fast. And the thing about the medicine of that stone was people would have a vision immediately. It didn't take 4 days, it would just take one night. So they knew there was a power to it, and I know that Sid Fiddler went there to meet the elders and have a pipe. He's from out here. And he told me that when he sat on that rock, he could feel it move, like it vibrated when he was on. So it's a strong, that's what that island is known for. I say, I shared my spirit name, and I shared my English name, and my last phrase, Omino Anagondanda, it says, all those of good heart, let us be. And I like saying that for the people, because it means a lot for us with regard to Indigenous knowledge, research, and methodology. That's all we're doing, is we're letting ourselves be, and we're explaining that in a language in this way. So I just wanted to share a little bit about the language, because the language is so important and crucial to Indigenous knowledge research. Although we don't have, a plethora of speakers, we have elders now that we have to go to. And so, really Indigenous knowledge would probably be intellectualized in the language, but we're not at that capacity always, unless we can get the elders together in one room and that they wouldn't fight. My grandfather had a great sense of humor, and he always would make place in the language with different things. So we say a horse is Bejagoji in the language, but he liked to say Nishigoji, because a horse has, it's not a split on the hoof. It's a singular, right? Because it's like a cup upside down. Anyways, that was really cute when he would always remind people that it's Nishigoji, when that's not the word for horse, but he would always find something silly in the language. My research is like narrative, qualitative research, just speaking to the discourse in the Western world. But I want to share a few terms to explain in Anishinaabe what that would be. So, Anishinaabe Gikendoswin is Anishinaabe knowledge, not just information, but the synthesis of our personal teachings. Gikendoswin comes through stories, songs, oral teachings, dreams, ceremonies. Biskobliang, an approach to research that attempts to decolonize Anishinaabe and Anishinaabe Gikendoswin. Biskobli is the stem verb meaning to return to oneself. Willie Ermine would refer to this as an inward mission, the ideology in relation to worldview that directs knowledge gathering, determines the purpose and method for knowing, a valid inner search for subjective inner knowledge in order to arrive at insights to existence, continued personal development, and of Aboriginal epistemology. Vincent Steinhauer, an elder from Saddle Lake, or who was a developing elder, would say the elders always taught him, go inside, go inside, go inside. Whenever there was a problem, it was the inner search that was out of balance. I like hearing from our elder Alma Quatras that we're not in perfect balance, because it's kind of like a bit of a relief, because we strive for wellness and we strive for balance, and I think sometimes we're hard on ourselves in that pursuit. We aren't perfect, and we do make mistakes, But that's all about that sacred journey inward to know yourself, because then when you make the sacred journey always as part of your day, you become more in balance and you're happier because you know yourself well. In my research, I used two forms of story to tell it. So the Indigenous methodology part would be those two forms of story, which are Devachinuin, personal story or experience, or Antisopanon, which is sacred story. Now, we're not really supposed to write sacred story down necessarily. I mean, I'm sure people would be chastised for that, but you can use pieces of it. And I spent my educational years working alongside elders, and so I know the cautions that they give for not being so free to write everything down. So one of our intellectual pursuits here is to navigate with an elder or our parents or our grandparents to know what's appropriate. Where do we stop and start with sacred teachings? So, people might start with a ceremony, a smudge, or even a sweat that lasts for a pipe, and they'll begin their research journey that way. They don't always talk about that, or they won't write it into the dissertation, but it is part of it. And aligning with an elder, many people weave the language through, and you're teaching the holistic view or piece to one part of the language, because one word has a lot to it. And you need elder consultation with that, so that you have the appropriate word for whatever thought you're trying to bring across. The elder or the language speaker, which is usually an elder now. Other Indigenous methodologies are, the tobacco offerings, the cloth prayer ceremony, and you can begin with that, and it goes throughout your research journey as an Indigenous person. We probably don't talk about that part, but we do smudge and have prayer before we start writing it. It helps clear our mind and center us again back to the work at hand, because nobody probably really loves racing to their computer to sit down and write for 6 hours. So we need some help to, except for Andrea. Other than that, the rest of us we normal. I guess I would just summarize that my research was about drum and song in school, and the elders that I work with, and trying to understand the root of where those drums came from. What are the original teachings? We teach the kids the steps and songs. We teach them, Cree songs and Anishinaabe songs, but we don't teach them the origin of things. And in asking around, it's interesting to find who knows those origin stories and who doesn't. Again, you're going to the elders again for that. And the collective memory, sometimes it's not always there. That it's lost, that the community has been Christianized, and they've lost that knowledge, or they've become English and they no longer recall. But there are also people who hid the knowledge, who went underground, and so you really have to search. I've found an elder who speaks about the original teachings, and he lives in the mountains, and in his childhood he would hear white people and they'd run. His job was to grab the children, the babies, the kids, and carry to them and run as far as he could for as long as he could, and then he would hide them in a cache in the mountainside, and he'd cover it with trees as a sound barrier, because they were afraid to be found and maybe have the children killed. And kids are unpredictable and they're noisy, so they could give themselves away easily. So he's very, he had quite an important role, and you know, he shared that for the first time the last time that I was with him. So yeah, that's the skinny on my dissertation work, and I just wanted to share a little story that Willie Irvine put in his book, and it's he got the story from my dad, and it's about there being a little ember, a little small, tiny, glowing fire that's going out, and it's very cold, and people were around trying to figure out how to make that fire bigger or to take a piece of it, and they moved closer, and they were able to put little toothpicks, little twigs on it to make the fire come up and to grow it. And when people got wind of the fact that Indian people had a fire when there was no fire, they tried to crush that circle to get to it. And they were able to just remain strong and not allow the fire to go out, and introduce the possibility that if they all worked together, they could maintain the fire. That's so essential for life. And when I've read that story many times, but when I read it again, I thought about the light that they talked about. And the light to me is the language, and that fire is going out. And I feel like we have such a big responsibility in terms of the language and the culture and its continuance, as we, you know, sit beside elders and have a workaday world, and still try to learn as much as we can, so that we don't lose our languages. Exit.
Thank you very much.